Well, good morning. Good morning, all, and thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you here for the latest in our series of Climate Safe California webinars. My name is Woody Hastings. I'm the Energy Program Manager with the Climate Center, and I am honored to be your webinar host today. Oops, let me get this off the screen. To make sure you're on the right bus, today's webinar is entitled, How Can Community Choice Agencies Expand Distributed Energy Resource Deployment and Address Resource Adequacy and Climate Goals? It's designed mainly for those of you focused on advancing DERs in a CCA context, but with further emphasis on how DERs can achieve resource adequacy and climate goals. But of course, all of you are welcome to attend. Just a few housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded and it'll be made available to all attendees and registrants. Attendees will be in listen-only mode through the duration of the webinar, but you can enter questions at any time in the question and answer box. That's our preferred, or the chat. And the Q&A session will be at the end of the webinar. We need to express our gratitude to our sponsors for today's webinar, Calpine Energy Solutions, Renewable America, Enphase, Peninsula Clean Energy, River City Bank, Blue Planet Energy, MCE, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Terra Verde Energy. Thank you, sponsors. We could not do these webinars without you. Really appreciate it. I'd like to take just a moment to make sure you all know about our flagship campaign, Climate Safe California. Climate Safe California is a 5-year initiative to enact, no later than 2025, accelerated California climate policies aligned with the latest climate science that will put us on track by 2030 for net negative emissions, carbon sequestration, resilient communities, and a vibrant, equitable, and healthful future for us all. Over 1,500 California organizations, climate leaders, elected officials, scientists, and individuals have endorsed Climate Safe California, and we invite you to review it and to endorse it. Duran has just placed a link to Climate Safe California in the chat. So please, not during the webinar, but at some point soon, take a look at that. And if you like what you see, please endorse Climate Safe California. Oops, a couple of little additional buttons there. All right, so getting to our webinar outline for today. So for today, we're gonna hear presentations from two distributed energy resource providers, Aryan of Renewable America and Michael Norbeck of Enphase. Ramping up distributed energy resources can help reduce greenhouse gases and create a more resilient electricity grid. In this webinar, these two DER service providers will present both grid side of the meter and customer side of the meter approaches that can be deployed within the existing regulatory environment that will meet CCA and state goals, reduce resource adequacy requirements, and provide greater local capacity during planned and unplanned outages. Next, after those two presentations, we'll have a panel of community choice experts who will respond to the DER provider proposals, discuss what their respective CCAs are working on to increase resilience in their service territories, and suggest what policy changes could support more rapid deployment of DERs. The CCA panel will feature Eric Little of CalCCA, that's the California Community Choice Association, JP Ross of East Bay Community Energy, and congrats to East Bay on their S&P A rating today, credit rating, congrats. And Jim Back of MCE. Community choice agencies must also meet mandated resource adequacy requirements, a reality that has become far more expensive in the past few years. So now, without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our first presenter, Artie Aryan of Renewable America. Take it away, Artie.
Hi, Woody. Thanks for the great introduction, and thanks Climate Center for the opportunity to present here today. I will share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Great. Okay. So I'd like to present today what we have worked on in the last 2 years, like what we call a streamlined process to deploy DERs. And basically, this is some sort of an overview how the market looks today, especially in California. If we compare two processes, if we look at bigger development, and I'm just focused here between 10 megawatts to 20 megawatts compared to smaller projects, maybe we can call them small utility scale, 1 to 4 megawatts, you can see that the deployment can be much faster. And here's a comparison between all those activities that we have. And the biggest change is interconnection and, of course, permitting. So I will explain more about this later. A little bit about what we have done in the last 2 years. As just Woody mentioned, this is all grid side projects, or for other folks that might know it, front of the meter. We have over 180 megawatt of solar projects throughout CAISO territory and 298 megawatts of energy storage under development. We have assessed over 1,000 of parcels, have been in touch to more than 400 landowners, and the projects are about 30 locations in general. They have different stages of development, and here you can just see where all of that, whoever is interested can go on our website. There is a good overview, and we're keeping it updated. Now, one of the biggest challenges that I know, and we keep getting into that conversation, it's about RA resource adequacy is one of the most important things today, especially for CCAs, and we do understand that. And I decided today to make that one slide to just show the different ways that a DER would have, depend on how it starts with the interconnection agreement. So what I just showed you in the slide before, the fast track deployment that allows us to be much quicker, that would limit us to just 2 scenarios. So we would be an energy only resource, and then there would be only a possibility to go through an annual DGD assessment, which is totally out of our control. It's basically CPUC allocating DGs into that portfolio, and then investor-owned utilities would have to kind of choose that substation. And unfortunately, the latest one, 2020, CPUC has not allocated any DGs. But we don't know for sure. We're hoping it's going to continue in 2021. This path was not working. Now, that what is exciting for us, we want to show here, there is a way after COD, so the project reached commercial operation date and is already operating. There is another process that is called transmission planning deliverability allocation, so-called TPDA, and that would allow us within 5 months, starting at every November, to get the RA value and the RA piece. So what we are offering is mainly, and that maybe could be a great idea for any other developer or other CCAs to think about it, to purchase projects in an early stage without RA, and after COD get the RA piece. Alternative to the fast track would be independent study and right away applied with FCDS, full capacity deliverability or partial capacity deliverability. The next CAISO cluster study 15 will be in March 2023, and the whole timeline for that is about 2 years. So that would be the comparison, but the great way that we figured out would be this TPDA way. So we also want to show that in our development, we pay a lot of attention in how we can mitigate any kind of impacts to the land or to any other resources there. And we are using pretty good software that allows us to minimize grading. And this is a single axis tracking system that we are showing on the right side, and on the left side, a screenshot from the software that can really go and without changing the natural slope of the land, so we avoid any kind of grading, we can install those systems. it makes it much easier for the CCA process, and we also believe that allows us to continue in the best way the deployment of DERs. Now, I want to tell a little bit more about this transmission planning deliverability allocation, the TPDA. So CAISO will be able through this process to assess the capacity deliverability possibilities throughout CAISO. The process is outlined here. As I mentioned before, every year in November, we can get started with it. And the results will be shared in the next year, March. Instead of waiting 2 years, we can do it within 5 months. And the deliverability whole study deposit is about $60,000 here. So it's all reasonable. Of course, there is a possibility that there will be no deliverability assigned, or the cost is just too expensive. Of course, we as a developer, we would take that burden. Now, energy storage in general, in all of our projects, we are doing our best to combine them with energy storage. So solar plus energy storage is our intention, and without grid charging. So we want to charge from renewable resources. And that just shows a little bit the overview about a hybrid system that would only sell the energy. So there is a possibility for the day ahead energy review, revenue generation, and there is other ancillary services like spinning reserves or regulation that would be the big benefit of the energy storage. So we're capable of supporting load serving entities and CCAs with those advantages and help them to figure out what will be the benefit and the valuation of that. And basically, this is a slide that just shows how the average value is changing when you have energy solar only. What's the average value in 2019, 2020, and 2021? And when you combine it with the energy storage part, without ancillary services and the ancillary services on top of it, plus the RECs. So it shows that we can create a lot of value with combining it with energy storage. And another slide that I like to show you is one of our approaches with the DERs is to provide resiliency. And this is a feeder line here up in Yolo County, close to Winters. It has experienced the PSP event, and PG&E Community Microgrid Enabling Program allowed us to plan here a microgrid, a community microgrid, also called multi-customer microgrid. So it's about 2.9 megawatt DC capacity of solar plus 3.7 megawatt of energy storage that we are going to install there. And with about 5 isolation devices, we are capable to keep the Winters Joint Union High School and the Greenwood Community Swim Center during an outage on grid and receiving electricity. So this is a project that is already vetted by the PG&E CMAP team, and we are talking to VCE about this project at this particular moment. And there's just an example how we could continue also with other places and other of our DER projects that has the opportunity to become a community microgrid as well. So that's pretty much it. And yeah, thanks, Woody, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Artie. And we will move over to Eric shortly, but I wanted to first just remind folks, if you have questions now, excuse me, I meant Michael Norbeck of Enphase, not Eric. Eric will be coming up in a little bit later. So we'll have Michael Norbeck next, but I just wanted to remind folks that if you have questions based on the presentation, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, please. So Michael, please take it away.
Awesome, thanks guys. Just trying to find the right window with my PowerPoint slides in it. It was up just a second ago. Give me one moment, please. There we go. Are folks able to see my slides?
Yes, we can see them just fine, thanks.
Fantastic. All right. So first of all, a little bit about Enphase. I don't know how many folks on the call may have heard of us or not. before I really got into this space, Enphase was one of the largest companies that I hadn't heard of before. So we are the largest residential inverter manufacturer in the US, and that makes us one of the largest in the world. And the inverter, for folks who are a little bit less in the weeds technically on some of this stuff, essentially is the brains that converts DC power generated by solar panels into AC that can be used by the home and the grid, and then also manages the interaction of that power generated at the customer premises with the grid as well. So it's kind of the power conversion and the brains. A little bit about us, we have about 2,000 employees now, a little over. We're headquartered in Fremont, so South Bay. Last couple of years have been really exciting for us. We booked about $1.5 billion in revenue during the course of this year, which is about an 80% growth rate over last year. Gross margins are good. The thing I get excited about is our scale and our reach. So we have almost 40 million of our projects, of our microinverter devices rather, deployed all over the world, which equates to about 12 gigawatts of solar capacity that we are enabling. This means about 1.7 million or more systems installed across 130 countries. So good global reach for us. We are, at core, a technology company. So semiconductors power our microinverters. We also have a battery product. A little bit more about those two kind of hardware pieces for us. So our microinverters are, they convert the DC to the AC power at the panel level. That takes place on the customer roof. So the current that comes down off the customer roof to the side of the customer house is lower voltage and it's AC. So it's a very safe technology. Also, if you have, say, a string inverter, which is also another common inverter technology, if one of your panels goes out or has a fault, your whole system goes down. Microinverter, if you have 10 panels on your roof, one of the inverters, your panel has trouble, the other 9 still operate. So it's a very safe and resilient technology. Our batteries use a lithium iron phosphate chemistry. This is a very safe, very stable chemistry. Now, folks may be aware of some of the challenges that some of the Tesla EVs have had, and the LG batteries, unfortunately, also using lithium ion technology. These have had a couple safety incidents where the batteries have reached what's called thermal runaway based on excessive heat or damage to the system, which creates a pretty unsafe condition. Not super common, but still very scary. It's nearly impossible to get a lithium iron battery into that state. So it's a very safe, very stable technology. Behind the semis and the batteries are our software products, right? So these are some really interesting capabilities for us, which we'll talk a little bit about in more detail in a couple of slides. But essentially, we have a software product that connects all of the devices at the customer premises and puts kind of control and visibility into exactly what those different pieces of hardware are doing into the customer's hands. I've been in this space for a long time now, worked for a few different companies that do kind of the solar and storage thing for customers or interact with them. Our app is very powerful. I think I can safely say it's best in class for the degree of, again, control and visibility that it enables for customers. It's a pretty cool piece of tech. And then on the back end, kind of behind the software and the hardware, is the Ensemble firmware. And this is the platform that would connect all of the distributed loads and load control devices at the customer premises, into one configuration. So this means solar and battery, of course. It also means, load control via smart devices. We have generator and fuel cell integration for folks who want to bring those devices online. And then we also are in the final stages of purchasing Clipper Creek, which is one of the largest EV smart charger manufacturing OEMs. We will be finishing that acquisition later this month, but essentially that brings a whole new set of capabilities under kind of our load management framework, which should be very powerful for customers. So a little bit about kind of how our tech stacks up. This is just a quick, high-level diagram to show you where the different pieces are and how they work together. So of course you have the microinverters on the roof, as we talked about. Going down the side of the house there, you see the IQ system controller. This is the kind of the hardware box that connects all of the distributed devices and loads of the customer premises, right? So this is where all the load management gets done. You have the generator or fuel cell, which is additional resiliency for the customer if they want that. You have the utility meter and the grid represented by those red wires. The IQ battery, of course, is what can store the energy that the panels generate. The IQ load controller hooks up to your main panel, right? So we have a load control capability as well that allows you to turn on and turn off different circuits at your premises if you would like, to help extend the life of your battery during a grid outage or to help manage kind of the power draw from your house to control your bill. And then of course you have the EV charger in the garage. So just a quick look at how these different technologies physically stack up to create the integrated load management and resiliency experience we work hard to deliver to customers. So a little bit more about our software. When we say autonomous decision-making of DERs, this essentially means, the customer can set different profiles for how they want their system to operate. I want to maximize my savings under a time of use tariff. I want to maximize my backup capability in the event of a grid outage. I want to maximize the amount of solar that I consume on premises and minimize my exports to the grid. I want to make sure that if a storm is coming, my system defaults to charge up my battery as quickly as possible and leave it at a steady state to help me power through a potential outage. All those different customer preferences can be translated into decision-making at the DER level, right? So how does the solar and the battery and other controllable loads of the customer premises interact to achieve that desired customer end state? So our software does that. This allows us, of course, also to seamlessly transfer the customer on grid and off grid. So if there's a grid outage, customer can island safely without any glitches, right? Keep all the appliances running, keep the internet on. When the power comes back on, they seamlessly transition right back onto the grid. User, again, can control the settings for their devices via cloud architecture that's enabled by the software. So it's a pretty cool piece of technology. One thing that I didn't mention on this slide is we are now launching the first microinverter, the first inverter period really, that allows for daylight solar backup. So as a lot of folks may know, if you have solar only at your house, if the grid goes out, your power doesn't stay on, right? It creates an unsafe operating condition if the solar system can't island, and traditional solar inverters don't island. So our new IQ8D inverters, just to get a little wonky, really allow solar backup during daytime if there is a grid outage. So it's a full microgrid forming inverter. So that's coming soon. It's a pretty cool product. Just allows us to deliver resiliency and of course bill savings to more and more customers, even if battery isn't really on the cards for them. So a little bit more about our software and kind of what this does for customers. A couple different pieces here, condensed them into one slide for the sake of time. But essentially we have a homeowner app that can help folks manage their interaction with grid services programs. This is a self-serve interface that allows customers to enroll in grid services programs available in their area if they like. They can monitor exactly how their system has been performing in response to grid services requirements or delivery events. They can opt into or opt out of events to the extent that that's allowed under program rules. And they can also figure out how much money their system is making for them in the context of participating in a program. So it's pretty cool. It puts a lot of, again, control over program participation and visibility into exactly what the system is doing in the customer's hands. Battery profiles, as we talked about before, can also help optimize across a range of customer use cases, right? So how do I maximize the money I make in grid services event participation, right? How do I capture the greatest incentives that I can? How do I manage my system for resiliency, right? Again, that goes into the customer's hand with our app. The other piece of software, which is separate but complementary, is kind of a SaaS product or a platform. Think about it as like a DERMS Lite that we enable for utility partners or other load managers to create virtual power plants, so aggregations, groups of our battery and solar products to help manage planning and operational loading conditions that they may need to address, right? So it's a very simple, streamlined, very user-friendly interface that allows you to create asset groupings, set charge, discharge commands, power quality commands at the inverter level, and give you a lot of visibility into exactly what those systems are doing. So it's just a way for you to scale engagement with our assets if that's interesting to you, to see what exactly are they doing, how do I get very granular performance control and visibility into how I have them operating in response to my grid conditions. Happy to talk about that more for folks who are interested later on. So we think about the technologies that we've talked about here, a little bit about us, but the most interesting thing for me today is really to talk about you guys, right? What's out there? What are you interested in? We see a lot of really exciting opportunities to build a cleaner customer-focused grid for CCAs. I'm going to tell you some stuff you already know, so bear with me, but hopefully that'll spur an interesting discussion later, right? So we know you have a mandate for change, right? CCAs come together to deliver cleaner, more affordable energy to their communities, the communities they serve. Your customers, your community members want new technologies for decarbonization, resiliency, and cost savings. You guys are best positioned to deliver those quickly and efficiently, right? You also have a mandate for community-focused planning and investment, right? How do you leverage the investment your communities are making in you to deliver better products, better services, better local economic growth than the IOU business model would enable, right? Very exciting stuff. You guys are here for a reason, and you can use that mandate to do really cool stuff. One of those things is a chance to build best-in-class customer programs, right? You know how to reach your priority customers as efficiently as possible in a much more granular and focused way than a top-down IOU approach would, right? You have the chance to meet compliance obligations using new approaches that can reduce uncertainty and better utilize the full capabilities of new technologies. One example of that would be a load modification approach for resource adequacy procurement, right? That better utilizes the capabilities of behind the meter storage as one aspect, or the load shaping devices. So how do we get to, meeting commission mandates as quickly, cleanly, and efficiently as possible? You have the chance to do that based on how you're set up, which is pretty cool. And then finally, you have a chance to leverage best practices to create a very compelling customer value prop for program participation and drive scale in your program reach. So these here, the bullets I have on the slide aren't meant to be prescriptive. They're just ideas and thoughts that we thought it might make sense to bring into the conversation today based on our team's work with CCAs and other folks over the past 10 or 15 years, things that we have seen work well to bring programs to scale. I know a lot of this stuff is going to be pretty familiar. We have a lot of very bright program designers and managers on the call today, but it's a few ideas we thought it might be fun to talk about. So one is adopt an 8x5x11 principle for program design. Think about bringing all of the key criteria for your program, participation requirements, performance requirements, compensation for the customer, what does good look like, onto a single sheet of paper. And kind of our foil or our key point of comparison there would be, say, SCHIP, for example, everybody's favorite program. 150-page manual, updated sporadically. You got to track program updates across 5 different websites. We all know how difficult this program can be to use, right? There's a chance to do it simpler, faster, cleaner. And I think, we can all see the value potentially in doing that, right? So think about paying for performance in a clear, consistent, and simple way, right? Help customers understand, or participants understand, what they are getting from sharing the capacity of their resources or their devices with you guys as the LSE, right? How do customers see the value prop for participating? How do they understand it very clearly so that they're motivated to participate as often and as effectively as possible? Think about stacking incentives for services delivered, right? If customers are potentially delivering you, an energy hedge product, or a capacity product, or a load shaping product, the ability to stack those different revenue streams based on the capabilities being delivered will encourage customers to share more of their technology and their capabilities with you, right? Think about measuring device performance at the inverter as well, right? That's kind of a cool idea. We see a lot in the kind of incumbent resource adequacy and demand response frameworks. It's all this, how do we think about reducing load against an assumed baseline? If we're talking about behind the meter resources, which is where I sit most of the time, right? There are easier and cleaner ways to do this. What about looking at the revenue grade metering embedded in the customer inverter to say, geez, what is that battery? What is that solar resource doing in real time, right? Easier, cleaner, simpler. And then finally, equity is a key consideration. It's important to us. We know it's important to you guys. How do we extend the reach of these technologies that customers want, solar, battery, controllable loads, to folks irrespective of where they may be income-wise, right? It's an important thing. It's a tough nut to crack. A lot of good and admirable work has been done in California trying to address this set of challenges up to now. There have been some challenges with the implementation, as we all know. You think about SCHIP and all these buckets and eligibility criteria, and it can be really hard from the developer perspective to get access to the funding that may make a project possible to be built, right? You can be kind of stack complexity on top of complexity in pursuit of a laudable outcome in California more often than not, and that can be pretty tough, right? What about instead thinking about creating a program structure or an incentive structure that just incorporates simple adders for folks who qualify based on income or other criteria, right? So whatever upper middle class customer qualifies for X, incentive, lower income customer qualifies for 2X or 3X that incentive, right? Keep it simple. This allows you to bring, program participation and technology to a lot of folks. We're hoping more cleanly and efficiently. We've seen this succeed in other areas beyond California. And then finally, we've talked a little bit top down, right? What's the mandate? What's the vision? Well, let's think about bottom up, right? How do we actually build and put some of these ideas into practice? And we would submit that solar, storage, and controllable loads can be key building blocks here, right? These are technologies that customers regularly want, that deliver bill savings and resiliency to customers. And they can be kind of the backbone or the foundation for putting a lot of these programmatic ideas into practice. I just have one more slide here. I want to be mindful of time, but scaling from some of those, program strategies into near-term opportunities was kind of one of the challenges we wanted to take on today for the conversation. So how do we think about getting to interesting, meaningful asset participation quickly and efficiently? We've been very impressed and very, honestly, really excited about that recent bonding initiative. A lot of the folks on the call have been involved in, right? $2 billion for, forward contracts on renewable energy at the community level is a huge deal. First in class, best in class. This is really exciting. We're going to be very, very interested to see how the progress goes there, what kind of contracts you're able to sign up, how it works. I think it's an awesome, awesome first step, big deal, right? How do we think about potentially expanding that bonding or debt facility to incorporate additional resources that provide additional capabilities, right, to CCAs? Do we think about forward capacity contracts? Do we think about additional price hedging or backstop for intermittent renewables that can be delivered by aggregated dispatchable resources, right? So buying a big, renewable PPA is a great thing. It's important. We all know it is. But there are still going to be pieces of your load requirement that big PPA is not going to resolve, right? There's going to be peaks. There's going to be load shaping considerations that, again, a large, renewable portfolio by itself will not fully address, right? But if you can smooth that out with dispatchable resources that can be shapeable based on your requirements, that's just a way to make that large renewable portfolio that much more valuable, that much more of the time. So just an idea to consider. Another area of progress that we've been really excited to see folks dive into is this community resiliency hub notion, right? How do we bring, clean, resilient technology to critical community facilities to keep them on if the grid goes out, right? We'd submit, it might be interesting to consider including VPP enablement, virtual power plant enablement for those projects that are being built, right? How do we ensure that local governments and site owners and tenants all are benefiting from the full value creation potential of the technologies that are being built, right? In addition to critical load backup, right? That's a tough nut to crack. Again, making sure that the benefits of distributed solar and battery and load control really are fully disseminated across all the folks who might come in contact with that technology is a tough thing. But again, enabling grid services and shapeable load control as a function of also turning on the hardware can be a big deal and a game changer, right? Our question for you is, how might we be able to scale a turnkey offering for installation, O&M, and grid services delivery, right? We have a network of hundreds of installers in the US, many of which are located right here in the Bay Area and elsewhere in California, right? We can bring best-in-class EPC work to the table, make sure that the assets perform over their lifetime, and then also leverage our unique capabilities around asset management and the software side and market interaction to ensure that you're getting the greatest value from these technologies, and customers are too. And then finally, one other idea to think about is, how do we look at locating or moving legacy program funds toward more grid responsive, resilient technologies, right? We were really excited to see the great progress that MCE recently made with moving some of that energy efficiency funding program allocation to their Peak Flex program. This is a really cool program idea. We think it's a great structure, right? They went through the process of becoming the energy efficiency program administrator approved by the commission, and they got access to the dollars that otherwise would go to PG&E to run programs decades old, right? I can imagine, and Jim can probably speak to this and others in more detail, it took a lot of work to get there. It was a multi-year process from what we understand, right? But it set a really interesting precedent, right? We are seeing now that CCAs can take more control over the funds that are being used to supposedly deliver products and services to their communities, right? We think that's a really interesting idea. One step further, how might we work together to further unlock existing program dollars allocated to IOUs, right? We think the process of going through the energy efficiency program admin sign up, it's a valuable one. I'm sure a lot of good learning there, but should it really be necessary, right? Should we have to prove that we're able to meet certain, legacy program management requirements and all the work that goes into that just to get the funds that are meant to serve our communities? I don't know. Maybe there's a better way to do it. Maybe we say, look, we have the capabilities and the know-how and the vision and the resources from a staff perspective to build out really cool programs. All we need is the funding resources to put those into action, right? Our question is, how might we be able to assist you on that journey, right? More voices together means stronger voices, and we'd love to help however we can. I think I may have gone over my 10 minutes. I apologize if I have, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for the time today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that jam-packed and compelling presentation. Really great. We are going to move next to our CCA panel. Before we do, we do have some questions coming in, and that's great. Already starting to see a little bit of a theme on questions around yesterday's CPUC decision on NEM. So CCA folks might want to touch on how that might impact things. I would like to move on to introducing our webinar, our CCA panel. We're going to hear first from Eric Little, Director of Regulatory Affairs at the California Community Choice Association. Then we'll hear from Jim Bach, Distributed Energy Resources Manager for MCE, and then JP Ross, Vice President of Local Development, Electrification, and Innovation for East Bay Community Energy. First, let's go to Eric. Eric, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let me just pull up my presentation here, and I will get going. This should be relatively quick. I am here, unfortunately, to talk about one of the more unpopular items, which is the regulations. And so I want to be very, very clear as I go through this, that I am not here to say that you cannot have RA come from distributed energy resources. I'm not here to say that it's impossible. I'm here to walk you through the history so that you understand why it has been difficult to be able to do, but not necessarily impossible. And I'm pretty sure that Jim and JP will be talking about the ways that they manage to satisfy these constraints within the procurement that they're doing. I live in the regulatory world where we say, well, what should the rules be in the future? So again, this is really a background on the history of how resource adequacy came to where it is. And it seems to be kind of the holy grail of value stream for resources, given the capacity constraints that we're seeing on the grid. So it is a very, very lucrative area to be in, and that's why there is so much focus on it. So just going back in history, when you look at it, it goes back to 1998 when we deregulated the generation sector of the utility industry. And at that point in time, not only did we deregulate, but we also put some pretty strong emphasis on not utilizing traditional systems of building and developing resources for the long term, but rather at that point in time, the load serving entities, which were primarily the investor-owned utilities, were instructed to, one, sell at least 50% of their thermal resources. They ended up selling nearly all of them because of the incentives that they had. They were also told not to hedge forward. They were told that the spot market in California was going to do everything that you needed, simply buy out of the California Power Exchange. For those that don't recognize that name, they were bankrupted during the energy crisis. They still actually exist to this day in a bankruptcy proceeding. So it's been 20 plus years of them going on of not being a functional entity at this point. The problem that we had was then in 2000, we had the energy crisis, and that led to rotating outages. And it also led to some very significant cost increases. In fact, so significant that one of the 3 IOUs was forced into bankruptcy. A second one was very, very close. And the third, because of having recovered some costs early on, was actually able to change their rate structure to where they passed on those higher rates to their customers. And so the threat of bankruptcy was very much averted for that utility. And so it created a lot of issues and a lot of questions about things. And I think there was a rethink then in 2004 that said, look, this reliance on the spot market isn't really working. I think we do need to hedge risk. Not only do we need to hedge risk, but we need to make sure that resources are procured and made available to the California independent system operators so that we don't have rotating outages. And that was what the original design of the resource adequacy program was supposed to do. So the RA program really looks at a fleet of resources necessary to reliably operate the grid, and that if only that set of resources showed up, would the grid be able to operate reliably? So it meant looking not only at the peak, but all hours. And in looking at all hours, they use some methodologies to try to deal with that. Obviously, if you meet your peak load with resources that are available 24/7, you are well over procured for the hour of the lowest load. And so there was some mechanisms in there to be able to deal with shaping. There was also originally kind of these two categories of resources that met resource adequacy, and one was supply side type of resources, which is typically thought of as generators. Energy storage now as well, which is not a generator, but is an entity that can dispatch energy to look a lot like generation during periods where it's discharging. And then we had load modifying, which was really the idea of, well, okay, maybe I don't need to serve all of that load because maybe I can prevent the load from existing. And that was things like demand response and energy efficiency types of items. And I'll get into a little bit about how these things become difficult. So let me also pause here for a moment because I don't have it in my slides, but it bears some clarification. When it comes to distributed energy resources, there's kind of two types. There's in front of the meter and there's behind the meter. In front of the meter is easier for RA to deal with, but as was noted by Artie, there's a lot of process involved from an interconnection standpoint to make sure that the resource is quote unquote deliverable, i.e. if it outputs a megawatt and injects that into the grid, that it can be withdrawn from the grid anywhere to be able to satisfy load needs. That means you need to make sure that the transmission system is capable of transmitting that power anywhere and that it doesn't become congested because of transmission constraints. That interconnection process looks at that and figures out if there's upgrades that need to be built, even if you're interconnecting to distribution, because ultimately it has to push through the distribution system back up onto the transmission system to be deliverable elsewhere. That's where that concern comes in. So in front of the meter, relatively easy to deal with, but again, as already noted, costly and time consuming to be able to do it. Behind the meter resources is a wholly different one though. And the issue here has been a lot like the demand response and the energy efficiency is, well, it really kind of looks like this load modifying resource because I don't meter it directly. I don't know what it's doing in terms of output. And further, we've got issues about whether or not you can dispatch those resources. So I just want to draw the distinction between those two for the crowd assembled here, because they are very, very different when you look at these. So why has the RA program been so difficult for these distributed energy resources? And I'm really going to look at the behind the meter because, again, for the in front of the meter, I don't think it's as difficult. It does have the other problems that were noted, but the behind the meter is really where the struggle is. And it's because of this issue that really the desire has been to have resources that I can dispatch. So the California Independent System Operator wants to be able to tell a resource, generate or don't generate. It would love to be able to tell resources to consume or not consume as well. And in some cases it has those capabilities, but not in all. So when you start looking at those types of activities and the ability to dispatch a behind the meter resource becomes very difficult. And in fact, for demand response, which started off as this load modifying resource, became a resource subject to dispatch and is bid into the ISO's market now as a resource instead of just as this kind of behind the scenes load modification that can happen. The main reason for that is that price signals are an important indicator of when there is grid stress. If there is a reliability problem, you would expect prices to go up. And when those prices go up, you would expect load to be lower and you would expect generation to be higher to try to take care of the grid problems that you're having. So even on the load modifying side, the commission and the California ISO really pushed to move those resources onto a supply side. The next item here is really about that these behind the meter resources, and you saw it in Michael's presentation, there's multiple value streams to them. And while I've mentioned RA as a significant one, it's not the only one. So there's a lot of things that happen. Retail billing concerns can be a large driver behind the use of behind the meter resources. Providing DR from those types of resources, in particular energy storage devices, right? If I've got a battery that I could consume out of my own stored energy rather than consume off of the grid, I could curtail my load to the grid and provide that type of a service and consume out of my battery in the meantime. And then there's this aggregation of resources to be able to provide energy into the ISO's market space. So that you can get the energy revenues out of the California ISO. So all of those things compete for how that resource is going to be used. And when it's a behind the meter resource that's not being bid into the market, it becomes really difficult for the ISO to know what's actually going to be available, how they're going to respond, and when they're going to respond. And so you have a lot of uncertainty associated with a resource and its ability to meet your reliability needs at a given point in time. So again, not advocating for you can't do anything here, just telling you where the problems have been historically and the issues that people have faced. We also have this issue, as I mentioned, about resources operating as if they're a supply side resource. It's an equity issue. Do you have to follow an ISO must offer obligation if you're going to provide resource adequacy? Do you have to have metering to be able to validate your operation? And how do you deal with that type of metering? Again, behind the meter resource, there is a meter for consumption and nothing else. So when you start metering an energy storage device, if you're at 10 kilowatts of load before the event is called, and you're still at 10 kilowatts of load after the event is called, yet you're discharging the battery, did you really provide a response that the ISO was looking for? Was your load really going to go up to 20 kilowatts, and really what you did was reduce the load to the ISO by 10 kilowatts? Or was your load only going to be 10 kilowatts and the battery storage device discharging really didn't change anything on the ISO's grid? So there's a lot of questions about how to meter and what people should get credit for. And then there's this issue about the points of injection. So when I've got distributed energy resources and I'm going to participate in the ISO's market, I typically need to aggregate them. They're small devices, and in the ISO's market space, you really need to be a bigger resource to be able to really effectively participate. But now when I aggregate those resources, they sit at different points. And as you may or may not know, we have an LMP, a locational marginal price, which says at a particular location, here's the value of energy. And those are at various transmission locations that show whether there's congestion on the transmission system. That's a lot of the reason for prices being different between them. And so when I have these distributed energy resources that may come at multiple different pricing points, I have to figure out where the energy is going to come from and how it gets distributed on the grid and what that does to change flows. We also then have the problem of on the distribution system that a lot of distribution grids were not designed to have this type of a flow on them. They were designed to be a consumption primarily and not really a generator. And so there is that difficulty of when it starts flowing the opposite direction, does it create a problem on the distribution system? So that was all that I had for today. Again, just talking about where the difficulties lie and the issues that need to be resolved. I am looking forward to resolving those issues. It's a thorny patch, though. It's not an easy one to get through. So Woody, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Eric. And folks, I forgot to mention last time, it would help us a bit if your questions are directed to a specific presenter. If you could indicate, we could sometimes figure it out, but if you could indicate who the question is directed to, that would be helpful. I'd like to now hand it over to our second CCA presenter, responder, Jim Bach, Distributed Energy Resources Manager for MCE. Jim, you ready?
Yes, thank you, Woody. I'm going to do just a very brief presentation. So let me share my screen because I want to sort of illustrate what we're doing with regard to our behind the meter resources and as part of our overall solution here. All right. Let me just make sure I can get this screen shared. All right, can everyone see my screen?
We can see it, thanks.
Okay, very good. So MCE is doing a lot with regard to renewable energy and our traditional procurement. So we're doing a lot, and we were founded on the basis of providing clean, cost-effective renewable energy to our customers. And we continue that effort and a lot of our procurements for our traditional annual integrated resources planning, open season, and ad hoc procurement that we do. And for RA, this includes storage and now long duration storage. We're also trying to contract for some of it standalone, some of it paired with other resources. So that's part of our ongoing efforts. and we continue that. But I want to talk a little bit and more about our distributed energy resources programs, because I think it's very relevant to our strategy moving forward for how do we want to leverage the resources that are embedded in our customers now, and how do we want to try and maximize those resources to help reduce our costs for all of our customers. And so we've got this strategy for leveraging DER through a number of different means. We are looking at this not just from resource adequacy, which is a huge potential need, but also resiliency. We're responding to our resiliency needs of our customers that are driven largely by the wildfire events and public safety power shutoffs, and reducing pollution from polluting diesel generators, and enabling more renewable energy to be brought onto the grid. So that's a big driver for us, as well as I mentioned the resource adequacy and capacity costs. Peak loads generally rely on polluting power, so we want to try and reduce the amount of peak demand so that we can reduce that polluting generation on the grid as well. So we're doing this through a number of different means for behind the meter resources. Our energy storage program is going to be paired energy storage with rooftop solar, existing or new energy storage. And in that model that we're using, we're actually going to be directly controlling these behind the meter resources via a DERMS platform, a distributed energy management system. And so we'll be able to monitor and dispatch those in a virtual power plant, all these aggregated systems. And right now, these are going to be out of market. A strategy is really looking at reducing our peak demand. That will ultimately reduce our capacity forecast that the CEC does and the resulting resource adequacy. So we're reducing our resource adequacy requirements through these programs rather than participating directly in the market. And there's a number of reasons for that that we can get into through the questions that I want to pose to some of the presenters. But we found it more effective to be able to directly control these loads and get the full value for peak load reduction. And this energy storage program that we have is one way of doing that. We're looking at some other pilot programs that do incorporate market integrated resources, so we could participate directly in the ISO market. And our DERMS platform has the capability of doing that. Right now, there's a lot of hurdles to getting into the market. I think as Eric indicated briefly on. We're looking at other types of load reduction pilot programs as well. We have a smart EV charging pilot that provides controllable EV charging for peak load reduction through a third party. And we have our peak, it's a peak flex market. Demand flex market was the old name for it, but it's now a peak flex market. And that provides payments directly to third-party aggregators for metered demand response or energy efficiency. And that's essentially paying them around, I think it's 19 cents a kilowatt hour for reducing peak. And we will put a day ahead price or a signal together, and anyone who can respond to that, we pay for that metered reduction. And it's essentially an out-of-market market, if you will. It's outside the ISO market, but it's a marketplace where any kind of provider that can aggregate resources and provide that load reduction can participate in that market. So we think it's a very innovative way of approaching this particular situation or solution for us. And I wanted to talk just very briefly about the program. The program includes a number of different partners, trade allies, software platforms. Workforce development is a big element of this program. And we have a financing offer to try and help people get involved in the program or participate in the program. And we're providing some upfront incentives and monthly payments, and for non-residential customers, a payment for every kilowatt hour that's reduced. In order to try and sign up 15 megawatt hours in a 2-year period for this system that we can control directly. And then eventually we'll look at doing a broader program where we're going to target more DERs and more different types of distributed resources. It's important to note that the DERMS platform that we have is not just for storage. It can be electric vehicles, it can be heat pump hot water heaters, smart thermostats, any kind of controllable device. And the idea is to try and get as many of these different devices behind the meter, monitored and controlled, and be able to respond and shape our loads to better match our cost profile. So it's a way, again, of helping us reduce our costs for all customers. And the platform really is just relies on getting these vendors to input data into our software platform, and then we just are able to directly control through using an open source communications protocol via in devices or signals to the developer. And it's mainly right now we're looking at daily peak load management. So we're charging directly from solar every day these resources, and then discharging them during the 4 to 9 p.m. period peak. But we also have the ability to do pre-charging for announced public safety power shutoffs. And of course, the emergency outages, the systems will go into backup mode. And these systems are owned by customers, not by MCE. All the assets, all the systems are owned by the customers, and they agree to allow MCE to program the systems. Future capabilities, as I mentioned, EV chargers, heat pump hot water heaters, all of this using an open ADR communications protocol, so that gives us the flexibility with open source protocols to switch vendors if we needed to switch vendors for the DERMS platform. And then we're looking at potential future value streams. As Eric mentioned, we're looking at resiliency values for both the grid and the customer, risk management value, including congestion revenue rights, wholesale market participation for either RA, load shift, ancillary services. And we're getting some of the benefits of peak load reduction, wholesale cost reduction, greenhouse gas content reduction, and NEM supply shift value, as well as potentially either transmission or distribution system deferrals. It does help us also retain our customers and provide economic development through the workforce development elements that we have. So that's just kind of a very quick overview of our energy storage program and our other behind the meter resources. But to sort of sum up, we really see the opportunity of these behind the meter resources and distributed resources as a way of becoming a larger and larger part of our resource portfolio, and essentially taking control of our own destiny using these customer embedded resources.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much, Jim. And now our last but not least, CCA panelist, JP Ross, Vice President of Local Development, Electrification, and Innovation for East Bay. Take it up, JP.
Thanks, Woody. Appreciate the introduction, and I'll keep it brief as I discuss East Bay's activities in this space. Very briefly, East Bay Community Energy is now serving over 700,000 meters in Alameda County and the city of Tracy. It's about 7 terawatt hours of annual load, and just about a gigawatt of resource adequacy that we have to provide every year. And we've certainly had a lot of kind of major procurement activities in the renewable space, having signed contracts for about over 550 megawatts of new renewables and 400 megawatt hours of batteries. In addition, on the resource adequacy side, we're in the buyer's market there. Certainly, need to buy supply side resource adequacy, and have done so through demand response providers like OhmConnect that are using proxy demand response as a the market integrated program for resource adequacy. We also signed a 25 megawatt peak hedge with OhmConnect as another mechanism to reduce our peak load. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about our behind the meter programs that are focused on reducing load and reducing our resource adequacy obligation. We have signed a contract with Sunrun, worked with Michael extensively on that prior to his move to his new job. And that program has been underway now since July of last year. We have over 400 single-family residential contracts signed and 8 multifamily residential housing units that are under contract, serving about 1,200 low-income affordable housing residents. The contract so far is set to deliver about 3 megawatts of load modification, load reduction, 12 megawatt hours. So it's a 4-hour dispatch period. And as Jim indicated or mentioned, we are actually supplying this load reduction through a permanent load shift program that we've worked on extensively with the California Energy Commission, whereby we file the load reduction in our annual peak demand filing with the CEC. That happens in April of each year for the following calendar year. And by reducing our peak load, we reduce our resource adequacy obligation. We put that in place. We started filing a couple years ago now with the CEC to test the approach. And what's really become clear with that approach, and I think this speaks to some of Eric's points, is the necessity, especially in new programs like this that are being tested out, of transparency that enable a CCA to, or any load serving entity for that matter, to really kind of prove additionality, and you do that with transparency. So we've set up quarterly meetings with the Energy Commission, whereby we actually show them the dispatch profiles of the batteries and how they are responding to dispatch signals, and the fact that we are delivering actual daily benefits of load reduction to our service territory. And that's something that actually is really appealing to our procurement team. A lot of the demand response providers really don't necessarily deliver energy into the market on DR days. So just because you're being paid for resource adequacy doesn't necessarily mean that energy and that capacity will be delivered into the market. A lot of times what we have seen is that DR will actually price itself out of the market even on days when it's called. And so that capacity doesn't necessarily show. So the capacity that we're having delivered, or the energy that we're having delivered, is delivered every day. And our procurement team appreciates that because they can count on that load reduction on a daily basis. And not, the CAISO days certainly drive prices, but there are many high price days that aren't CAISO DR days, or CAISO days where those DR resources would be called into the market. And I think it's important to note, again, something along the lines of what Eric was saying, is that if you have batteries in the market and they're responding to a lot of signals, whether that's a customer wanting to arbitrage TOU energy, or a customer wanting to save battery energy for a PSPS event, or to maximize the self-consumption of their solar energy, there's a lot of conflicting signals going to those batteries. What's important then for us as an LSE, as we're contracting for this resource, is that we know when that energy is going to come online, and we know it's going to come online every day. And we know it's going to come online over the period that's most important for reducing our peak demand, because batteries that are not under contract are generally just coming online to do TOU arbitrage. That means they come on at 4 p.m. and the energy is gone by 5:30, when our peaks are later on in the afternoon. So we need extended dispatch over a known period in order to actually reduce our peak demands. And those hours will actually shift over the course of the year during, in different seasons. So we want to be responsive so that those batteries are actually reducing our peak in a forecastable way. That's our residential program. We also have a commercial program focused on delivering solar and storage projects to a fleet of publicly owned critical facilities. So think of them as public resilience hubs. These are fire stations, administration buildings, food banks, senior centers, libraries, across our territory. So we will be issuing our first solicitation for about 40 facilities. That'll be 5 megawatts of PV and 4 megawatt hours of storage that will be delivering resilience to our communities in 4 cities. So our first 4 cities are Berkeley, Fremont, Hayward, and San Leandro. And we'll be issuing a solicitation on behalf of those cities. We will be the counterparty through PPA that we have developed and now agreed upon with our cities. So we'll be the counterparty, the intermediary between our cities and the vendors. And we think that will help reduce transactions costs because it's just one PPA that needs to be negotiated for 36 sites. And then we'll be looking for ways to get wholesale kind of commodity value from those solar and battery systems. And I'm sure there's lots of questions about NEM. I'm seeing them in the Q&A. We can get deeper into them. And there's certainly some erosion on the commercial side because there's not a grid access fee in the current PD. I think that that impact is less than it is on the residential side of the market, but it's still having some impact, at least as far as my initial analysis goes. So I'm sure we can get into more discussion there. Those are some of the ways that EBCE is interacting with this growing fleet of distributed energy resources to meet our energy and resource adequacy needs.
Well, thank you, JP, and thank you to all the presenters. So we will now get into your questions. If you have not yet entered your question into the Q&A, please do so now. We've probably already got more questions than we'll be able to answer here and now on the webinar. That's fairly typical. I'd like to start with the earliest question. First question we got was from David Springer. It was all around the issue of sort of the hot off the press issue of the CPUC's proposed decision on the NEM successor tariff, and the question all around, how does it affect your business, DER deployment, and a follow-up question from Joel was, or additional question from Joel was, is it possible that there might be an expansion of opportunities for DERs if there is a movement, a defection, a mass defection of folks with solar and storage departing the grid altogether? So and it's really not directed to any one of you. So anyone who wants to sort of kick off a response to that question, take it. Go ahead.
I can start to respond from my perspective. So as mentioned, we have done extensive analysis on some of our commercial. I'll start with our commercial program, and I'm seeing probably a 20 to 30% reduction in yield in the commercial space for solar plus storage projects due to at least the NEM PD as it stands. Doesn't have a grid access charge, but I think the net billing element is one thing that that is impacted. I've also run economics on some standalone storage projects, and those tank quite extensively. So we initially had put some solar only projects in to kind of juice the economics and make sure that we could have a viable portfolio. And that strategy is now yielding negative returns. So we probably won't have any standalone solar projects. So that'll make a portfolio harder to finance. But on the residential side, I think the residential single family is going to be really hard to make happen if you add $50 a month or so in fixed charges. Hopefully, we get an alternate decision out that reduces that grid access charge. In the multifamily affordable space, hopeful that we will still have a viable economics in that space, but we'll see how the economics are impacted. As far as the next question on opportunity to expand DERs, I'd say that's something that we'll certainly be looking at. I don't think that this is going to create a huge movement of people with existing PV. Anyone who's on NEM 1 or 2 they're just not going to touch their system, and that's actually, I think, one of the biggest. Well, there's multiple bad outcomes from this NEM ruling, but we have, I think, 40,000 existing, basically standalone PV systems installed in EBC's service territory. And we should be aggressively adding storage to those systems. And anything that freezes touching those systems in the addition of storage is something that the PUC should not be drafting any rules that kind of slow down the addition of storage. And unfortunately, as it stands, this would certainly do that. So I think that's a big impact. And I don't really see this new NEM ruling creating a lot of momentum for energy paired storage because the economics are just much worse.
Thanks, JP. Did anybody else want to speak to this one?
I guess I'll just build from a lot of what JP mentioned. I mean, I'll be honest, our policy team is still unpacking the proposed decision. There's a lot in there, and figuring out how all the pieces stack up is going to take some time, I think, from our perspective, at least, to really get our arms around it. I'd say we have some significant concerns. We are hoping that some of the levers that are in the PD do encourage at least more battery uptake. But as JP mentioned, we're not sure exactly how that's going to look and how quickly it's going to happen. I think a lot of the stuff around, reducing the grandfathered period for existing NEM customers, that's pretty troubling. You thought you bought a system or leased a system 5 or 10 years ago with an assumption on how much money you would save. Now that gets screwed up, right? That's a little weird. I think there's a lot of motivation to make solar and battery technology more equitable and affordable and accessible, and that's a good thing. The way that the PD goes about it, I think, creates additional complexity and potential confusion. It's kind of, putting a series of band-aids on some very larger cuts that probably won't actually help really address the fundamental challenges inherent in getting more technology to a diverse array of customers. That's also troubling. Again, a lot to figure out there. I hesitate to make a very strong declarative statement one way or the other, but a lot of questions and a lot of some confusion and some stress for us. I'm not going to lie. It's troubling.
Well, thanks both. Let's maybe move on to other questions. There was a question early on directly for Artie. Artie, does the Puta Creek microgrid project directly address the over-the-fence constraints that currently exist? It's a reference to Rule 218 that prohibits folks sharing energy laterally, essentially. So.
Yeah, we are familiar with the over-the-fence constraint, and we know how difficult it becomes for a single customer microgrid, where you want to create your own kind of way of being able to island it. The difference to Puta microgrid project, it's a multi-customer microgrid. So the difference is it's a grid serving. The interconnection agreement is not Rule 21. It's a W.dot interconnection agreement. So it's on the wholesale market. And that's where it becomes PG&E CMAP eligible. And basically under that program, it becomes under the control center of PG&E. PG&E will decide about if it becomes a grid forming or it has to stay on the islanding function. This is all controlled by software. So this is something very new. I think some folks might have heard about the Redwood Coast Microgrid Airport. And this is kind of the role model we are trying to follow.
I see. So it does not impact that prohibition at all. So because it's basically utility controlled. Okay, we had a question for Michael from Jerry Glaser, which was the acquisition of Clipper Creek. Will that enable Enphase to start a vehicle-to-home product project?
That is a great question. That's the multi-billion-dollar question, man. I think that is certainly the goal. The key is how soon can we do it? And I'm going to probably just say some very obvious stuff that a lot of folks already understand, so forgive me. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, a lot of the V to X, V to B, V to H enablement is based on what auto OEMs are comfortable with doing, right? Can we get the auto manufacturers comfortable with allowing their systems to push power bidirectionally? We've had a lot of actually very productive conversations with several OEMs on that subject, and I think the dialogue is advancing much faster than we have seen in the industry over the past 5 years. We've been talking about V2X for a long time, as a clean energy technology industry. We're actually seeing meaningful progress now. You have, the one key use case of the Ford F-150 Lightning, which will enable, V2Home, which is pretty cool. You have the Nissan Leafs, of course, which also enable V2X, which is really exciting. I think, as we get more comfort from OEMs, we're going to see more possibilities. That certainly is a key assumption built into our acquisition of Clipper Creek, right? How do we make that EV resource not just useful from a window-eyed, time my EV charging to maximize my time of use savings, which is important, but how do I really make that into more of a home and grid asset? So I would say, yes, it does change the game for us, and we will keep kind of pushing the dialogue with our auto manufacturer partners to get to more interesting solutions as quickly as possible.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else want to speak to this sort of issue of integration of multiple resources in general? One of the proceedings at the CPUC, it hasn't been mentioned yet, but there's a high DER future proceeding. The Climate Center is a party to that proceeding. I wonder if anybody wants to speak to this sort of issue of connection, tying it all together, aggregation of these varying resources, really both customer and utility side of the grid. From my perspective, I think it's important. So can someone, and that's what a lot of the questions we're getting sort of are all around. Can anybody want to speak to that? Not necessarily in the context of the high DER proceeding, but sort of the general notion of tying the resources together. And I know we've touched on that, and someone used the word ensemble. Just wondering, can someone speak to that some more?
Yeah, I'll kind of address that. I mean, that's part of the approach that we're looking at from our behind the meter program, and that is looking at leveraging all forms of DER that are controllable, and trying to get the most out of those resources. And for us, using this software platform where we can monitor and control this and dispatch this, we'd like to be able to do that for a variety of different reasons and a variety of different uses. So whether that's just peak load reduction, which is our primary use case now, because it's largely reducing our resource adequacy costs, which are a huge cost for us, and they're going to get bigger. But also future opportunity for doing things like distribution infrastructure deferral. If that ever becomes a reality, we'd like to be able to leverage these resources to do multiple uses. So you can do a lot with these batteries as an asset if the rules allow, and currently there are a lot of questions around that. We'd like to be able to dispatch these for in-market, out-of-market distribution deferral, and design systems that can do multiple things. Right now, you're looking at a lot of systems that are being designed just for resiliency, backup power. And if you can design a system that can provide backup power, but also do a distribution deferral using different reserve margins and a resource adequacy reduction, then we should be able to do that. If we're investing in these assets, then we need to get the most out of them. And in light of the current proposed decision, it becomes all that more important to get more out of those assets and your investment in those assets. And actually, this was a question that I wanted to ask both Artie and Michael is, what do you see as the value of multiple use application? How do you get the most out of these, both from an in front of the meter standpoint? How important is getting multiple uses out of that battery? If a microgrid like blue sky operation for the economics of front of the meter project, and for Michael, how is that like valuable now, especially in the context of this potential M3 decision for getting customers to participate with solar and solar plus storage?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for bringing up that question. I think it's very important to think about the blue sky mode, especially when you talk about a microgrid project, because how many times will a PSPS event happen in the future of a lifetime of 35 years? We have no idea about that. So it's very important that there are benefits to those resources and we can combine it in other ways. So therefore, You just mentioned what we do with the peak load. So this is one way of using dispatchable energy. There is ancillary services, that's the other way. Then we have in general directs. And then we have the RA value. That's how we look at all those different benefits of combining it with energy storage. And also, I think in general, there was this Wall Street Journal article that I have seen in July saying specifically how much is the need of CAISO to have electricity more between 4 to 9 p.m. And we all know how important that is. So I believe solar will be combined in the future, definitely with energy storage, and the most part of how we can bring the other part of the benefits into that resiliency will be one important factor, but it cannot be staying by itself alone. Another thing that I want to mention is we have many of those projects where the landowner that is giving us a long-term lease of the land, where we are going to develop a project that is on the grid side, has also his own electricity use. So one of the projects in Eureka, they have about 14 gigawatt hour of electricity use. So he wants to know how can he save electricity, like on his own electricity bill, how can he save something? And what we calculate there as a separate system, so would be not on the wholesale, it would be then the Rule 21 on the customer side. We have to separate them, they cannot be combined. So will be as ever possible that there is a regulation coming out in the future which would allow to make multiple uses out of one system, and so that it doesn't make it so complicated and we have to separate everything. These are all great questions, and we're excited about hopefully seeing those improvements.
I have a follow-on question.
Oh yeah. Sorry, JP, go ahead.
Yeah, Michael, and it's to you. But since we worked on load mod with the CEC and basically convinced them that having metered output from a hybrid resource that we could prove to them was a mechanism for proving permanent load shift, and we specifically went away from a DR project that required a baseline for proving not that the capacity or the load didn't show. How do you bring those two things together? Because then you've got CEC with permanent load shift, and you've got CAISO PUC with like some kind of a DR response. How does that ensemble fit together? In the current regulatory approach, that's like apples and oranges. So I'm curious how you think about doing that.
Such a good question. I would say, at the risk of sounding glib, you choose your customers and your partners very carefully. I think a lot of experience in CAISO integrated transactions and the CAISO tariffs. Interesting scale potential there. And JP, you're very well familiar with this, Jim, and a lot of other folks are too. And Eric, I think a lot of your comments were very on point about this as well. It's just a really hard path to efficient resource monetization and delivery. It's just super tough. We are hoping that some of the PUC and CAISO frameworks evolve over time. We are just starting to dip our toes into the ELRP waters now. It still has, the compensation and valuation framework is still not totally clear to us. It seems like some of the proposed decision language had the ability to measure at the device inverter and potentially count exports, but they also mentioned assessing performance against a baseline. So I'm certainly not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I scratch my head a little bit about that. Like, am I missing something, or what are they doing? So to the extent that we can understand that, the compensation rates that they proposed are interesting. Measuring it as an energy product is interesting, right? I think we'll want to learn more about that. But really, I think the ability to deliver, a firm, shapeable or shaped load profile, right, that allows you to take it off the top of your supply obligation. I mean, I'm biased because JP and I spent so much time on this, but it's simple, it's clean. You're working with an agency that, has control over the load forecast and the allocation on the front end. It's just, from an administrative perspective and from a, clarity and consistency of delivery perspective, I think there's a lot of advantages as opposed to going through the whole CAISO integration rigmarole and the post hoc assessment of performance that just injects uncertainty for everybody and challenge and frustration and administrative burden. And it's just a bummer in a lot of ways. I think, Jim, to your original question, which is a really good one, figuring out how we are able to reflect the different values that a portfolio of DERs provides across the use cases that you described: distribution deferral, energy price hedging, load shaping, renewable firming. These things are really important, right? And to the extent that we're able to help customers understand how their products are enabling each of these value deliveries, whether that's a compensation or a communication exercise, maybe some of both, that's really important. You'll get more engagement from customers over time if customers understand the value that they are enabling, right? We found that to be true across a number of different programs. So that's a cool way to, just to start the conversation. I would say when you have the ability to ladder up a whole range of customer connected loads at the customer premises and present that as either an aggregated or a disaggregated portfolio of devices or premises to the LSC, that becomes very powerful too, especially if you have one coordinating platform that gives you visibility into what each of those assets are doing, right? It's kind of a cool thing. So I think the stuff that you guys are doing with the DERMS platform, very exciting, very cool. And I think to the extent that you're able to tie that platform and its capabilities to more of that granularity at the customer premises, you're going to help folks again see the value that a thermostat provides, that a battery provides, that solar provides, and what those assets can do in aggregate to create a bigger piece of shapeable load for you as the LSC. So a lot of really exciting possibilities, and I'm just super stoked to see what you guys continue to do.
We're getting down to our last 5 minutes here, so we're going to need to wrap soon. I'm wondering if I'd like to bring Eric back into the conversation a bit, if I could. Eric, you had presented a slide, I think it was titled Load Modifying, that was all around the challenges for customer side of the meter DERs to be to address resource adequacy. And we've heard from JP and Jim about some of the work they're doing, and it seems to me that it comes down to aggregation, automation, and pre-arrangements between the customer and the load serving entity, and with the ability to start to look at these aggregated, automated demand side flexibility as something that could ultimately fulfill RA. Can you speak to that? And this would probably be the last little comment before we go to wrap.
Yeah, sure. And I'm sorry to get very technical on you here, but the issue really is, are you using it as a demand response resource, i.e. reducing your load to zero, or are you using it to actually push electrons back onto the grid? It's the pushing electrons back onto the grid that creates the difficulties. If you're simply using it as demand response to reduce loads, that model already exists and is already in use. It's when you then go beyond that and say, now the load is negative, I'm actually becoming a generator and pushing energy onto the grid. That's when you get into all the difficulties of, is the distribution system capable of handling it? How do I meter that? How do I effectively dispatch that? All of those types of things. So that's the difference between the two. The DR model exists. It doesn't always take care of all of the capacity that you may have installed though.
But just one point on that, with hybrid solar and storage systems, interconnection in NEM already allows for pushing electricity into the grid. So, I think just a point there, like we've already gone through that process.
Okay, and that's going to have to be our final point. I do need to bring it all to a close. So just wanted to really thank you all for this excellent suite of presentations and conversation, and it's been really great. Appreciate the questions from the attendees. I'm going to share my screen again. Bring it over here just for some final pointers. Hopefully folks can see my screen. I just wanted to once again mention our Climate Safe California program. And so, oops, it's not working here. Hold on just a second. Okay. Climate Safe California, Duran had dropped that link into the chat. It's our flagship program, and please have a look at that and endorse it if you like what you see. Just a few notes about upcoming Climate Safe California webinars tomorrow. If you haven't had enough screen time over the last few days, December 16th, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Our series is all around investments in climate action, so maximizing benefits of climate investments. On January 26th, we're going to have a webinar focusing on sustainable mobility. And in February, investing in workers, the just transition for a fossil-free world. So those are some upcoming webinars. There will be many more coming up in March, April, May, and throughout the summer. So hope you can join us for those. With that, I just want to thank everyone for attending our webinar. That's my contact information. You can certainly dial in with the Climate Center through a number of platforms, social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We have e-news that you can sign up for. So visit our website, theclimatecenter.org, and find out all about the things we're doing. And once again, thank you to all the presenters, our sponsors, and all of our attendees today. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.